Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm talking not about the trial of a book, but about a trial and then the book of that trial. The trial is of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, in which he was charged effectively with being responsible for the Holocaust. The book is Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which has shaped ever since the way that people think about the trial itself. What actually happened in the trial, and is Arendt's judgment of it fair? I am aware in this series that we have moved from 1945 and the trial of Marshal Pétain through to Lady Chatterley's lover and now Eichmann in Jerusalem. And it may seem like we have missed something out because I haven't done an episode on the Nuremberg war crimes trials. In this series, I've wanted to focus on trials that are themselves focused on particular cases, particular individuals or groups of individuals. And I just felt the Nuremberg trials were too much to be contained in a single episode, even a pair of episodes, too much going on there. In a way, too many complicated, overlapping and intersecting stories. I am not in any way trying to downplay their significance. They are in many ways the most significant political trials of the 20th century. And they do hang in the background of this case. And indeed, for many people, the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, in the light of the Nuremberg trials, was a retrograde event. It was a backward step because the Nuremberg trials had established at least a couple of principles that the trial of Eichmann seemed to breach. One of those principles was the creation of a new set of crimes, of offences, crimes against humanity. And what, after all, was the Holocaust if it was not a crime against humanity? And yet here in the trial of Eichmann, it was not framed in those terms. It was explicitly a crime against the Jewish people, against the Jews, not the human race as a whole, the Jewish race. And secondly, the Nuremberg trials had established the principles that the appropriate venue for these kinds of cases is an international tribunal, not a national court, but an international body of judges for cases that cross national boundaries, where the criminality is of a scale and of an extent that it cannot be contained within a national court of law. And yet the trial of Eichmann was in an Israeli court, presided over by Israeli judges, and the defendant was charged with crimes that were Israeli crimes. The Israeli statute book was the frame of reference. And so there were a large number of people at the time who were critics of this trial. But by far the best known of those critics is Hannah Arendt. She was sent to cover the case. She was in the courtroom as a journalist, a reporter for The New Yorker. Her reports first appeared in The New Yorker in 1962, and then in 1963 they came out in the form of a book. And the book came to be the dominant artifact for everyone thinking about this trial. It's almost impossible to get back to the trial because you have to pass through Arendt's book. Some of her criticisms of the trial were ones that other people were making at the time. But in a couple of ways, she broke new ground. She provided a new framework or prism for thinking about this case. Partly because she came up with a phrase which was the subtitle of her book. Eichmann in Jerusalem is subtitled A Report on the Banality of Evil. And that phrase, the banality of evil, is now indelibly associated with the case of Adolf Eichmann because, as Arendt pointed out, she wasn't the only person to spot this, but she framed it in a catchphrase that has stuck ever since. This man was a mouse. This man who was being charged with responsibility for the deaths of 6 million people, 6 million Jews, seemed incapable of such a crime because he was such a meek and mousy human being. He was empty. He was a kind of cipher. The banality of evil means if this is evil, it is so banal because it is so everyday. He's just an everyman. How can an everyman be responsible for the worst of all crimes? But she also created a kind of sideshow to the whole case. The real controversy of her book didn't have anything particularly to do with the legal proceedings. It was a short set of passages in the book that highlighted an issue that she felt the case had neglected. And these arguments were completely incendiary. They were a provocation, not just to Jews, but particularly to Jews, that more or less exploded around Arendt and dogged her for the rest of her life. And they related to the behavior not of the Nazis, not of Eichmann himself, but of the Jewish leaders, the leaders of the Jewish councils in the places occupied by the Nazis from which Jews were sent to their death in the concentration camps. The leaders of the Jewish councils, who Arendt said were complicit in the Holocaust, because they were the ones who cooperated with the Nazi machine, the death machine, in providing lists of Jewish residents, organizing Jews to be transported, aiding with the mechanics of the transportation of millions of Jews to their deaths. And the really incendiary claim that Arendt made, and she puts it in these terms, is this: if Adolf Eichmann had never existed, nothing much would have changed. He was just a cog in the machine. He was a cipher. If it wasn't him, it would have been someone else. No Eichmann, you still get 6 million dead because the machinery of death would have continued to function. Someone else would have kept the cogs whirring. But she said, if the Jewish leaders in the places from which Jews were deported to their deaths had behaved differently, had resisted, had not been so complicit, if different men, and these were almost all men, if different men were in charge in the ghettos, in the places where Jews were herded before they were sent to their deaths, if they had put grit in the machinery of the Holocaust, millions would have lived. She claimed 6 million would not have died because it would not have been possible. The mechanics wouldn't have worked. The mechanics required not just the organization of the Nazi state, but also the complicity of the victims. And the complicity of the victims was engineered by Jewish leaders across mainly Eastern Europe, particularly in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere, who allowed Jews to be meekly herded to their deaths. And that claim in Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is what exploded. So in those two respects, Arendt's argument was distinctive to her. She coined the phrase the banality of evil. She was the one who highlighted the question of Jewish complicity in the Holocaust and provoked a furious, outraged response. But in lots of other respects, she articulated in that book a criticism of the trial that was widely held at the time, including by many other Jews, particularly American Jews, assimilated American Jews. There was extensive criticism from the United States of the trial of Eichmann, criticism of its legal basis, of its claims to be the appropriate place in which such a man should be judged. And there were, before, during, and immediately after the trial, well before Arendt published her articles, never mind her book, a whole series of criticisms of this case across a range of fronts. Perhaps the most common criticism was the one that focused on the circumstances in which Eichmann was brought to Jerusalem. Everybody knew that he had been kidnapped in Argentina. So Eichmann's story, very briefly, is this. He was mentioned repeatedly in the Nuremberg tribunals, particularly by Nazis who wanted to shift the blame onto Eichmann. Eichmann was in many ways the ghost at those legal proceedings. But he was hiding in plain sight. For a number of years after the war, he lived under an assumed name in West Germany. But when he began to suspect it was getting too hot for him to be there, he fled to Argentina, where there were many former Nazis. He fled under an assumed name, but not long afterwards, he brought his wife and children over to live with him, and they retained the name Eichmann. They came as Eichmanns. It was reasonably widely known in the German expatriate community, the Nazis who lived in Argentina, who Eichmann was. He wasn't living in any grandeur or splendor. He was living a pretty squalid, impoverished life. He was a factory worker. But he was safe, and he was there. The way in which he came to the attention of the Israelis is almost an accident, a kind of monstrously ironic accident. Another German living in Argentina at this time was a man called Lothar Hermann, and he was also living under a false identity, not because he was a Nazi, but because he was a Jew. He was a Jewish emigre to Argentina, and he thought Argentina was too dangerous a place to be openly living as a German Jew because it was infested with Nazis. So that even Hermann's own daughter didn't know her father was Jewish. And his daughter started dating a young man called Klaus Eichmann. She did not know she was from a Jewish family, and she started dating basically a young Nazi. Klaus Eichmann was quite keen to boast about the fact that his family might have had connections with the higher echelons of the Nazi party. And when Hermann discovered who his daughter was dating, he asked his daughter essentially to try and find out whether Klaus Eichmann might be the son of Adolf Eichmann. And she went on a date with this boy, and he took her back to his house where she met a man whom he introduced as his uncle. And she was prepared to go back and tell her father, well, no, his father, Klaus Eichmann's father, is not there. It's just his uncle. But as they were leaving, she heard Klaus say to his uncle, "Goodbye, Papa." And she told her father, and by a circuitous and roundabout route, her father brought this to the attention of the Israeli authorities. And it took time, but in the end it was decided that this man would be picked up and brought to Israel. An operation was organized in which he would be captured and bundled into the back of a van, which is what happened, taken to a secret location and secretly flown out of the country in disguise. This was rendition, what we would now call rendition. It was not extradition. It was illegal. It should be said that Eichmann himself didn't really resist. So one of the things that astonished his captors, and this is part of the theme of the banality of evil, if they were expecting to encounter a monstrous Nazi, what they discovered was a mouse, a meek, broken down man living a fairly squalid life. He was barely providing for his family. And when they picked him up, he more or less admitted straight away that he was Adolf Eichmann. And from the start, he more or less cooperated. He did not try to resist. He answered their questions. In the end, he was going to give hours and hours and hours of testimony. He would be questioned before the case and during the case. His answers were long-winded, pedantic, pedestrian. He would deny the charges against him, but famously, he denied them in his terms by saying, "Not guilty as I am indicted." That is, clearly, I am in some sense the person that you think I am, but the way you have charged me with these crimes, I will not accept my guilt. Because his defense was going to be that he was just a cog in the machine. He had no discretion. He simply was obeying orders, the classic Nazi defense. I was just obeying orders. But even when they picked him up, whether it was an act, it seems more likely it was genuine. He was the sort of man who seemed predisposed to obey orders. One story that is told, and is apparently true, at the very beginning of his captivity, they had taken him, bundled him into a van, taken him to a secret location in Argentina, and he said to his captors that he needed to use the toilet. And so they said, "All right, we'll take you to the toilet. We will have to accompany you. We'll let you go in on your own, but there will be a guard standing outside." He went in, the door was shut, nothing happened. And suddenly the guard became terrified. What had he done? Had he killed himself in there? Banged on the door, and Eichmann said, "Do I have your permission to begin?" He was waiting to be given instructions that he was allowed to open his bowels. That's the man that we're dealing with. The fact that he was not legally extradited but kidnapped and taken by force to Israel was one of the reasons that many people claimed this trial was illegitimate. Another was that this was retrospective justice because the crimes with which he was charged were under a statute that had been enacted by the Israeli Knesset in 1950. He was eventually charged with 15 crimes, ranging from the murder, the mass murder of Jews, all the way through to membership of proscribed organizations, which included, under Israeli law, the SS and the Gestapo. But as many people pointed out, when these crimes took place, none of these laws existed, and that there is a principal injustice that the accused needs to be aware of the laws under which he might be charged. There was also an argument that was made that this couldn't be a fair trial because the judges were themselves Israeli Jews. How could they be fair when this was a case that was framed as a crime against the Jewish people under Israeli law, but the victims were identified not as humanity, but as the Jews? This was the Jews judging crimes against the Jews. This was a prejudiced court. So the circumstances in which Eichmann was brought to Israel were illegal. The charges were retrospective, and retrospective justice is no justice. And the court itself was prejudiced against the defendant. To be fair to Arendt, she had no problem with any of those three things. She thought all of that was a complete sideshow. How else was Eichmann going to be got out of Argentina? The appropriate extradition treaties were not in place. Anyway, the Argentine government had showed itself notoriously reluctant to allow Nazis to be extradited, to face justice. That's why the Nazis were there. That's why it was a safe haven. It was very, very difficult to get them out. This was Adolf Eichmann. How else was he going to be brought to justice except in the back of a van? Arendt had no problem with this being retrospective justice. Of course, in a sense, it's going to be retrospective, but Nuremberg was retrospective justice. These were new categories of crimes and cases that were created for the purposes of those tribunals. It is true, say under tax law, that if someone is charged with failing to pay tax which didn't exist as a tax at the time when they are being charged, why didn't you pay this rate of income tax? Well, if at that time the rate of income tax was lower, that is, of course, a defense. But we're not talking about tax law here. We're talking about the mass murder of an entire people. Is there anyone who would say, I didn't realize that was a crime until it became a crime under Israeli law? Everybody could understand that what Eichmann did, was part of, was responsible for, was criminal. Arendt thought that the judges in this case were impeccable. 3 Israeli judges, they were called Moshe Landau, Benjamin Halevi, and Yitzhak Rave. Arendt was full of praise for their precision, their attention to detail, their impartiality, their fairness, their readiness to shut down the prosecution when it went beyond its brief, or at least their attempt to shut down the prosecution when it went beyond its brief. Arendt thought that the judges were the best thing about this trial, in part because they were all originally German, as she was. The judges, when they wanted to speak to Eichmann in a case that was formally being held in Hebrew, would often speak to him in German, the language that Arendt was also most comfortable with, much more comfortable with German and then English, not with Hebrew. She liked them because she thought they were people like her. So she was okay with all of that. Her issue was the other one that was raised at the time, and this was raised in many different settings, particularly in the United States, in places as august as the New York Times, up and down from there. The complaint, not that this was retrospective justice, but there was something aggrandizing about the way in which an Israeli court was claiming to be the legitimate place to try this case. Because it was true that the victims were not Israeli citizens, because the state of Israel did not exist. So this is not the question about when the laws were enacted, but the mere fact that this is being tried in an Israeli court as though the victims were Israeli, but they were not. They were Jewish, but that is, as everybody knows, not the same thing as Israeli. And these crimes did not take place on the territory that had become Israel. It did not take place on the territory that had existed before the state of Israel existed. It didn't happen in Palestine. It happened in Europe. These were almost all the inhabitants of European states killed on the continent of Europe. Would not the appropriate place for this trial to take place, if it could not be an international tribunal? And most people understood by this point the circumstances of the Nuremberg tribunals couldn't be recreated because we were now bang in the heart of the Cold War, and Soviet-American cooperation was simply not going to be forthcoming in the way that it could be achieved in 1945. But many people said the appropriate place for these crimes to be heard, for the trial to take place, is West Germany. Why does Israel get to do it? And Arendt had that problem too. She thought this trial was aggrandizing the rights of the Israeli state to speak for Jews. And many, particularly American Jews, felt the same and wrote articles complaining in exactly those terms. If this is a case against a man charged with killing Jews, it does not follow that Israel gets to speak for Jews in deciding where, when, how, and under what circumstances this case will take place. The case was framed as though Israel was the body that spoke for the Jewish people. And many said no. Many of those who said no were anti-Zionists. Arendt was not an anti-Zionist. She had once been a Zionist, but she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of travel of the Israeli state, its claims to speak for all Jews, its emphasis on its Jewishness, on Jewish history, on being the repository of Jewish identity, and ultimately being the carrier of the memory of the Holocaust. Arendt wanted this to be a case framed as a crime against humanity, and she thought that framing it as a crime against the Jews gave the state of Israel too great a claim to speak for all Jews. She had no problem with the judges, but she had a big problem with the prosecutor, who was the Israeli Attorney General at the time, a man called Gideon Hausner. He was not originally German, he was originally Ukrainian, but he had moved to the Palestinian territory in 1928. He framed the case, Arendt thought, as a kind of morality tale, as a history lesson. And he went way beyond his brief, Arendt thought, in trying to articulate the perspective of the victims. So she, for instance, had a problem with his famous opening remarks at the trial. He began in these words: "In the place where I stand before you, judges of Israel, to present the case against Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone. With me at this point stand 6 million accusers. But they cannot rise to their feet, point an accusing finger toward the glass booth, and cry out towards the one sitting there, 'I accuse.' For their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka, washed away in the rivers of Poland, and their graves are scattered across Europe, from one end to the other. Their blood cries out, but their voices cannot be heard. Therefore, I will be their mouthpiece, and I will say on their behalf the terrible indictment." And Arendt was not alone, powerful though that speech was, in thinking that it was wrong. It invokes another trial that I've talked about in this series, Dreyfus, and the famous J'accuse letter that Émile Zola wrote to the president of the French Republic. But as many people pointed out, there's a big difference between Zola's J'accuse and this J'accuse, because Zola was not accusing on behalf of Dreyfus. He was not trying to be Dreyfus's mouthpiece. He was speaking for himself. I, Émile Zola, accuse you, the President of the Republic, of a cover-up of this set of crimes, essentially. Dreyfus was almost a bystander. In this case, Hausner says he is speaking for the victims and they are the ones doing the accusing. This is a trial in which the victims will be allowed to speak. Now, of course, in a court of law, hearing from the victims is an important part of many legal criminal proceedings. But this is the opening of the case. The victims are going to prosecute. And Arendt was not alone in thinking this was some pretty crude form of justice. As she said, if your family is killed, the state will prosecute the killers on your behalf in the name of the state, not in the name of your family. Your family are not the prosecutors. The state is the prosecutor. She thought in this case, the prosecuting should be done on behalf, in the name of, humanity, as at Nuremberg, not on behalf and in the name of the Jewish people, let alone on behalf and in the name of the victims of the man in the dock. In Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt called Eichmann's trial a show trial. And by that, she didn't just mean that the outcome was foreordained. And again, she didn't really have a problem with the fact that, of course, he was going to be found guilty, and she had no problem with him being executed. She wanted him to be executed. She just didn't want him to be executed in this way. But she called it a show trial mainly because she said it was a show. It was a kind of performance, a morality tale, a form of education, trying to teach the Jewish people about their history, particularly young Israelis. The Prime Minister of Israel at this time, David Ben-Gurion, was explicit that he wanted the trial of Eichmann to be an education. And a lot of the trial was taken up with hearing from victims, eyewitness testimony from the people who were there about the circumstances of the Holocaust, much of it irrelevant to the case of Eichmann, unless Eichmann was believed to be responsible for everything that happened in the Holocaust. And that was also one of the points of controversy that we'll come to. But the case was clearly set up as a kind of performance. It took place in a courtroom that was chosen because it had once been a theatre. It was a kind of art centre. And the court looked a little like a stage, and the choreography was very carefully managed. The glass booth that the prosecutor referred to in that opening statement. This is the image that many people remember of the Eichmann case. This meek and mousy man in his glasses sitting in this booth, cut off from the rest of the court. It's a very antiseptic, formal-looking court. It looks like the set for a kind of modernist play. It was designed for television. Of all the trials I've talked about to this point, this was the first one that happened in the television age. So previous trials, including Pétain, they were filmed for newsreel. The show trials, the Moscow show trials, were filmed for newsreel. But newsreel is different from television. This was a television trial. It was not broadcast live on television. It was broadcast live on the radio in Israel every day. Proceedings were broadcast live. It was filmed, and the film was edited and was flown to the United States every night of the trial so that it could appear on the next day's network news bulletins. And it did. This trial did serve in the United States as well as in Israel and in Europe as a kind of history lesson about the Holocaust. That is how many people covered this trial. Eichmann was almost irrelevant. Witness after witness, victim after victim, gave harrowing testimony as to what had actually happened, what it had been like to be there when the killing of a people took place. So it was designed as a show. And actually, to start with at least, it did capture the world's attention. But there was a lot of competition. The trial opened on the 11th of April, 1961, and scores of international journalists were there from Europe, from the United States, from South America. It was a huge international event. And the very next day, on the 12th of April, the news broke that the first man, Yuri Gagarin, had gone into space. And on the 15th of April, Gagarin gave a press conference in Moscow that was attended by 1,000 international journalists, and it knocked Eichmann off the front pages. Eichmann's trial never resumed its place as the number one news story in the world. On the 17th of April, during the first week of Eichmann's trial, news broke of the failed US-sponsored invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And again, Eichmann was pushed down the news agenda. It never disappeared from the news agenda. It was covered by the main TV networks in the United States. It was widely reported on by newspapers around the world. It succeeded in those terms. But this was exactly what Arendt objected to. This was not formal legal justice. This was a kind of moral show business. And then her other objection was that, given the way it had been set up, this was about the greatest crime in history against the Jewish people, and we are going to tell that story, the whole story, the story of the Holocaust. This is going to be a case about the Holocaust. The man in the dock could not sustain that weight. If it was a case specifically about Eichmann, what did Eichmann do? Who saw Eichmann do it? Where are the witnesses to Eichmann's actions? Not witnesses from Auschwitz and Treblinka, not witnesses to the full range of crimes committed by the Nazis, but the specific witnesses to the crimes of this man. It would have been a completely different kind of case. And, as Arendt suspected, a much thinner case, because there wasn't much evidence of that kind, because this man was a bureaucrat, because he was a cipher, because he was, Arendt believed, a cog in the machine. And she thought that there was a fundamental contradiction at the heart of this case. And again, she wasn't alone in this, though she framed it in a way that became the dominant narrative. The contradiction was the prosecution wanted to say that the Holocaust was a top-down, carefully planned, carefully organized, deliberate murder of a people. It was not random. It was not episodic. It was not haphazard. It was a planned and executed scheme that came from the top. If that is true, then it was hard to pin it all on Eichmann. Eichmann was not the top. Eichmann rose relatively high up in the Nazi hierarchy, but he was always an underling, serving Himmler, serving others, performing tasks devised and decided by others. And this was his defense. He always insisted, under cross-examination, that it wasn't his choice. He was doing what he was told. So he wasn't high up enough for the top-down narrative. Alternatively, if the argument was, even a man like Eichmann, not at the very top, but high up enough, had the discretion so that if these crimes took place, it was because men like Eichmann facilitated them, used the power that they had to make this happen. Then it's not just about Eichmann, because there were hundreds of people who would have had discretion. If Eichmann had discretion, many others had discretion. And Eichmann's defense, which frankly was as incoherent in these terms as the prosecution, also played it both ways. At various points, Eichmann would say, I had no choice. I had to do what I was told. You don't understand how it worked. We were in a hierarchy and everybody was obedient to the hierarchy. But then when it was occasionally pointed out to him that something had happened on his watch, that it seemed to be something that wasn't specified in the broader scheme of the Holocaust, but really did depend on the bit that he was responsible for, he would then say, that was my underlings. They didn't do what they were told. They strayed beyond their brief. So he played it both ways too, but Arendt believed the prosecution played it both ways. It couldn't both be top-down and Eichmann's fault, because Eichmann was not the top. And if it was Eichmann's fault because Eichmann had discretion, well, so did many, many others. That's what she thought was the incoherence. And then she thought it was embodied in this man because he was so banal. There was a lot of anti-Semitism around this case, including in the United States. One or two people, not, it has to be said, Arendt, observed of Eichmann that the irony of this trial, that this craven, mousy, bespectacled, balding man in this courtroom in his little glass cage, he looked like the Jew, they said. What was so hard for some people to wrap their heads around was that the men guarding him, who were strong, healthy, dark-skinned, Middle Eastern Israeli Jews, the soldiers, didn't look like their imagination of a Jew. They were too strong and robust. It was Eichmann, they thought, who embodied the anti-Semitic trope of the slightly craven, cowering figure. Arendt did not say that. Arendt was not an anti-Semite, certainly not in those terms. She was herself Jewish, but some of those remarks about Eichmann's Jewishness came from Jews, just not Israeli Jews. For Arendt, the banality of Eichmann was not his appearance, it was his language. And she meant something very specific by the banality of evil. Another way she could have put it is that in this trial, evil is a cliche because every damn thing that comes out of this man's mouth is a cliche. The language he uses, bureaucratic, but not simply bureaucratic, also just hollow, unthinking, empty. This man is a cipher because in the way he talks, expresses himself, there is no personality. There is no one there. Everything he says could have been said by anyone because it is all dead, cliched language. He used formal bureaucratic terms to describe the horrific crimes of which he was accused because he was incapable of imaginative thought. And Arendt says, this is who he was, not simply as one of the men responsible for the machinery of the Holocaust. This is who he was. And her evidence for this is that he was an empty, cliched cipher in all his guises. When he was captured, the way he talked to his captors under interrogation, in the court, afterwards, when he was sentenced to death, on his way to the gallows, the last things that he said, everything that came out of his mouth was a cliche. He had no mind of his own. And this, for Arendt, was the great gaping gap at the heart of this case. There was no one there. The crimes of which he was accused seemed to require agency, seemed to require a man capable of that kind of intent, murderous intent. No one could believe that this man was a murderer. The prosecution tangled itself up in trying to prove that he was a murderer. He was accused, in this case, of being responsible for the deaths of millions, particularly of being responsible for the deaths of the hundreds of thousands who were sent to Auschwitz from Hungary in 1944, organized, their transportation organized by Eichmann. But he was also accused of literally killing a child, of being a murderer in the sense of being the man who committed the act. And that part of the prosecution fell apart. There was actually very little evidence that Eichmann had ever, in that sense, killed anyone. It's a bit like in the Pétain case. The prosecution, for clarity, was so determined to try and prove that Pétain had not simply been the man in the wrong place at the wrong time, but was a conspirator, had planned the whole thing, that they devoted the first week of the Pétain trial to trying to prove that when he was ambassador to Spain, he was part of a Nazi plot, and it fell apart. Likewise, the prosecutors of Eichmann spent too much of the case trying to show he'd killed a child when he almost certainly hadn't. And this, for Arendt, was exactly what was wrong with their case. They couldn't paint him as a killer. He was not a rabid anti-Semite. Eichmann himself often tried to say that he was a friend of the Jews. He was, he sometimes said, a Zionist. He had wanted to help Jews leave their terrible circumstances in Nazi Germany and find a place to live. That's what he claimed he thought he was doing during the phase of Jewish repression under the Nazis, which was at least framed not as murder, but simply removal from Europe to somewhere else. It was never established where that somewhere else was going to be. Nonetheless, Eichmann thought he was part of something that the Jews themselves, at least some of them, wanted, a land of their own. He was not a killer. And yet, as I was reading about this trial, looking at the pictures and some of the footage, reading Arendt's book, haunted by it in many ways, I found myself thinking there is a term for Eichmann which didn't exist at the time of the trial, didn't exist when Arendt was writing. It was a term that was only coined in the 1970s to describe a certain kind of criminal who often is banal, almost always a man, banal, conventional, conformist, often lives a life that in some lights can be painted as blameless, almost deliberately blameless, vanilla, and yet that life coincides with an assertion of power when the opportunity arises in very, very specific circumstances. When a gap opens up in which such people can assert themselves, they assert themselves murderously because they have concluded that the only way truly to establish their power, their identity through power, is by finding the gaps and inserting themselves into those gaps, and out of that act comes death. And the name for such people is serial killers. Now, I'm wary of using this term in relation to Eichmann. It seems wrong. I'm aware of that. It doesn't just seem inappropriate. It seems like the scale is wrong. And yet there is something about the reason that term was coined to describe this particular category, because such people were so hard to place. Because there was an expectation, which seems almost to be Arendt's expectation, that you face a binary choice here. Either you encounter someone who presents as a killer, or you encounter someone who is in some sense not responsible. Serial killers often do not present as killers. They lead conventional, meek, mousy lives. They are opportunists, but when the opportunity arises, often not because what they want to do is kill, but because killing is the ancillary device by which they can assert themselves, by which they can feel they exist. They have an identity, they have power in the world. And Eichmann was that. He was an opportunist. Every time the opportunity arose, as he rose up through the Nazi hierarchy, for him to assert his identity, he didn't assert his identity simply by obeying rules. He often went above and beyond. He asserted his identity by inserting himself into the gap in the system where he could be a powerful man. Right from the beginning, when he set up the mechanism by which, in theory at least, Jews were going to be removed from Europe and sent somewhere else, and their money would be extracted from them along the way. He began this process in Austria. And the Eichmann process, which was as bureaucratically, as formalistically as possible, to strip Jews of their possessions, to take that money and use it to fund, among other things, the expelling of Jews from Europe, and to create schemes under which Jews would be told they were going to a land of their own, but they would discover, most notoriously in what was called the Nisko scheme that Eichmann was responsible for, a place called Nisko, in German occupied what was once Poland. Barren, diseased, empty, unlivable land, to which tens of thousands of Jews were shipped and told, here is your land, here is where you can live. Eichmann did that. Eichmann organized that, and Eichmann knew it was death. There was no way to survive. There was no means of survival. This was not a scheme to give Jews a place of their own. This was a scheme that extracted money and then life. Why did Eichmann do it? He wasn't a rabid anti-Semite. He wasn't a killer. He did not have murderous instincts in the sense that he wanted to see these people die. When he used to visit his friend Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, he was very squeamish. Eichmann did not like to see what went on there. Serial killers are often quite squeamish. They have a very, very carefully calibrated and organized modus operandi, which allows them to be powerful in precisely the ways that they feel comfortable with. That was Eichmann, and the price was death, and he knew it. It's not as if he was ignorant. He knew what Nisko was. He knew what Treblinka was. He knew what Auschwitz was. And he did it. And he did it not because anyone would have done it under those circumstances, but because it suited him. He was well fitted for those moments when someone could go opportunistically a bit above and beyond what was asked of them, and millions would die as a result. Eichmann wasn't just a cipher. Eichmann was a serial killer. Another criticism that was made of the trial from a different direction by many people who were observing it as it happened, people who watched the footage as it came out, was also a criticism of Hausner, the prosecutor, and the way in which he questioned not Eichmann, but the witnesses to the Holocaust, because he had a repeated question for many of them, which is, why did you not resist? As they described the circumstances in which they were herded onto trains, taken away, led to their deaths, arrived at the death camps, sorted, families separated. Why, he wanted to know, did nobody fight back? And some people thought this line of questioning was cruel, it was heartless. Actually, he said afterwards, and it was quite effective in this respect, he asked the question because he wanted to give the victims the opportunity to say, we couldn't fight back. You don't understand. You had to be there. Too many people, comfortably, in America and elsewhere, people who had escaped the Holocaust, were asking that question. Why did the Jews not fight back, the Jews of Europe? And the prosecutor wanted to give them the opportunity to say, you cannot ask that question unless you are there. And if you are there, you do know and understand the astonishing courage of the few who did fight back, the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. But in most circumstances, for almost everyone, it simply wasn't a possibility. We were utterly powerless in the face of this man, Eichmann, and his machinery, of this serial killer. But Arendt went further, and this was the other thing and the cause of the controversy that exploded around her book, because she thought the question should not have been, why did you not fight back? She thought, at least of some, the question should have been, why were you complicit? She wanted the trial also to interrogate the role of Jewish leaders in the ghettos, in the places where Jews were contained before they were sent to their deaths. Why had they cooperated with the machinery of death? She understood all too well why Eichmann had cooperated, because she thought he was just a man born to cooperate. And after all, he did not pay any price for his cooperation. Actually, he benefited from it. But why had the Jewish leaders, the leaders of the Jewish councils, the people who knew the names of those who would be sent on the transports, why had they given those names? Why had they organized them? Why had they put them on sheets so they could be ticked off? Why had they had meetings with men like Eichmann, Eichmann who regularly met with Jewish leaders in order to organize the circumstance of transportation? Not of death, but of transportation. No one met with Jewish leaders to organize what would happen in Auschwitz, but Eichmann and others did meet with Jewish leaders to organize how the victims would be got there. Why did these people not resist? Arendt wasn't one of those who said they should have fought back, but why did they cooperate? Why didn't they simply refuse? Refusal is not the same as resistance, as armed resistance. Well, of course, in one sense it is the same, because the result would have been death. To refuse was to be treated as a resistor, presumably, and Arendt knows this, they did it out of fear. They did it because they felt they had no choice, but she still made the argument that there was latitude for a different response and a different outcome. What is there to be said of that argument that she made about Eichmann's trial? I think in that case, one can say of Arendt that she breached her own rules. She was going against her own argument against the trial, because her complaint about the prosecution was that so much of the evidence that was brought was irrelevant to the case of Eichmann himself. The litany of witnesses and their laments was indeed relevant to understanding the Holocaust, but this was not a trial trying to understand the Holocaust. She thought it should have been a trial trying to show how and why a man like this could be responsible. And therefore it had to focus very specifically on the kinds of things that Eichmann did, the very, very specific machinery of the Holocaust and his precise place in that machinery, not introduce all sorts of irrelevant information. Well, the question of whether those leaders of the Jewish councils could have behaved differently is irrelevant to the case of Eichmann. I was trying to think of an analogy, and again, like using the language of serial killer, I'm aware that even trying to find an analogy is somehow inappropriate in this case. But still, Arendt does it, and let me try and do the same. Arendt's argument seems almost to have been something like what someone might say in the case of a lynching. In the case of a lynching, a lynch mob kills an individual. And you might say that the person who did the actual killing, however it took place, there will have been maybe one or two of the mob who strung that person up, who took the life from that person. And you might get hold of those people. You might get hold of the killers and put them on trial. And would you want to say, well, I mean, really, should we be doing this because it doesn't matter if they hadn't done it, someone else would? No, Arendt wouldn't say that. No one would say that. And to be fair to Arendt, she doesn't say that of Eichmann. She doesn't say he shouldn't be on trial. He did it, and because he did it, and we have him, he has to die. But she also seems to be implying the trial really also needs to focus on the people who allowed the victim of the lynch mob to fall into its hands. Think of all the people who really made a difference. So you might say the person would have died anyway, even if the person that we have here and are putting on trial hadn't killed them, because someone else would have done it. So though this person is guilty, we shouldn't think that absent this person, the victim would have escaped. But the behavior that actually could have made a difference was the behavior of the people who allowed the victim to fall into the hands of a lynch mob. Say it was a person who sought some kind of sanctuary in various people's houses, and they closed their doors to that person as they were being pursued by the lynch mob, ran on a series of doorbells, and the people inside, who were themselves terrified that if they opened the door, the mob would come in and kill them too. So they kept their doors shut, and eventually there was no sanctuary, there was no rescue, and the victim died. So you might be able to say, and this is more or less what Arendt does say, the people who made the difference were the ones who didn't open their doors. Had one of them opened their door, that person might still be alive. Once the doors were shut, death was foreordained. It was Eichmann, it was someone else, it doesn't matter. The killing would have happened. But if one imagines that analogy, it feels irrelevant. Would someone really, in a court of law which is prosecuting the ringleader of a lynch mob, say we should really be focusing here on the people who didn't open their doors? They might do it in some other context. There might be some other place in which that was the right thing to say, or at least to address, or at least to think about. How can we think about how and why people don't open their doors, and how and why they could be encouraged to open their doors next time, but not in relation to the legal proceedings. And Arendt's complaint about this case was about it as a legal process. And by raising the question of Jewish complicity in the context of a report on the trial, she trivialized it. It was literally inappropriate. It was not apposite. And I think for Arendt, ultimately, her problem with the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem is that it was an affront to her philosophy, to her worldview. And again, there are many contexts in which that might be articulated in a way that was interesting and challenging, but not in a report on the trial itself. One of her complaints about this trial is that the Israelis were particularizing something universal. This was a crime against humanity, and they were making it about them. Israeli Jews were making it about the state of Israel and its claim to speak for Jews. They were particularizing something universal. But because Arendt found it an affront to her philosophy, she was also particularizing it. She was making it too much about her. The ways it breached her view of how the world is and should be were many. So one of her complaints is that the trial focused on anti-Semitism, and it tried to locate the Holocaust in the long history of Jewish persecution, particularly but not exclusively in Europe and by Europeans. That the Holocaust was the culmination of a centuries-long, a millennia-long story of persecution. Arendt had a different view. She thought that the Holocaust was a particular outcome that could only happen under circumstances of modernity, specifically under the circumstances of the modern state. The vast bureaucratic machinery of modern politics, which is capable, when pointed in the wrong direction, of the most monstrous industrial scale of crime. The industrial nature of the Holocaust was for Arendt its salient feature, which meant it was a completely different kind of event from a pogrom, from the slaughter of Jews across the centuries. This had more in common with what totalitarian states do to other groups. That's why these are crimes against humanity. It's not special to the Jews, Arendt thought. This is what this kind of state is capable of doing to anyone, to all of us. We could all find ourselves on the receiving end, Jew and non-Jew alike. And it's because it can take men like Eichmann and turn them into cogs in the machine. She thought that this case was wrongly framed because the real threats were not threats to the Jewish people, real though those were. The real existential threats faced in the aftermath of the Second World War were to humanity as a whole. She was beginning to sense that the big question was the threat to the habitat in which we live, the habitat of humanity, the natural world. The environmental threat was looming because these monstrous industrial machines of slaughter, modern states, were capable of destroying anything and everything. And the biggest threat of all, she believed, in 1961, 1962, 1963, the years not just of the Bay of Pigs, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, was nuclear holocaust. That, she thought, is the existential threat we should be focused on. And if Eichmann has a lesson for us, Eichmann could pull the lever on the Holocaust, a man like Eichmann, because he's a cipher. He's a banal, empty, cliche-ridden machine. Such a man could also pull the lever on the nuclear Holocaust. Can you imagine Eichmann pressing the button? Of course you can. Someone above him would give the command, but men like Eichmann would be needed to follow their orders. This, Arendt thought, was the threat. And above all, I think, she found this trial an affront to her philosophy because she believed in the possibility of political rebirth. She thought that a well-functioning politics, which transcends mechanical, industrial politics, is a politics in which human relationships allow human beings, through political argument, contestation, and ultimately political decision-making, to reinvent themselves, to become something new. Politics, when it works well, is the vehicle through which human beings become something new. And she thought this trial exemplified a different kind of politics, the politics she had come to believe that characterized the Israeli state, anchored in the past, based on collective memory and collective identity and victimhood, she thought, and that this trial was trying to cement Israeli identity in the story, the long story of what had happened to the Jews at the hands of others, that Jewish identity was being framed through Jewish history, and that was the enemy of the possibility of rebirth, including rebirth of the state of Israel as somewhere that transcended its Jewish identity and could find a place for the peoples that it had displaced. She thought the Zionism in which she had once believed had become too narrow, too particular, and too grounded in a view of the past, less open than she wanted it to be to a wide range of possible futures. And the trial of Eichmann exemplified that. That was her complaint. There are grounds for thinking on all of these fronts. Arendt had a point. But it's impossible to read Eichmann in Jerusalem and not feel there is something off about it. It is deliberately provocative. Arendt was a great writer, in some other contexts, quite a academic, dry writer. But here, she has that quality. I almost think of it as a kind of New Yorker quality. The great New Yorker writers have it. There is an iciness to it. There is almost a condescension to it. She has been sent to this highly emotive, traumatic event, an event in which people will be recounting the most unspeakable things, and she is cool about it. She is reserved about it. She sees through it. She is willing to say the unsayable thing, which is that it irritated her. It annoyed her. She found some of the people ridiculous. She found the prosecution ridiculous and over the top. How can you say of someone trying a man accused of being responsible for the Holocaust that he has gone over the top? Arendt found a way to say it. And there is something creepily admirable about anyone's willingness not to be seduced. And great journalism, and this is journalism, not philosophy, Eichmann in Jerusalem, has that quality to it. And yet, there's something pretentious about it as well. There's something pretentious about the ways in which Arendt aggrandizes her own philosophy in accusing the Israeli state of aggrandizing its own position. She tries to get outside and beyond the Israeliness of this occasion by speaking for humanity, and she sounds pompous when she does it. But there's something else in Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is also a kind of New Yorker quality. It goes along often with that iciness, that steeliness, which is she comes across as a snob. There is something snobbish about her account of this trial. She's not wrong in many of the things that she says, but she says them with a sort of disdain. She's seen it and no one else has seen it. She's seen the emptiness of Eichmann. But it is really important to remember that for her, Eichmann's crime is a crime against language. He speaks in cliches. Arendt almost never spoke in cliches. She is a truly great writer. She hates the fact that this man can't use language in a way that allows it to live. That's his crime. It is the banality of cliche that she objects to here, and she is snobbish about it. She likes the judges because they're smart and they speak good German and they are precise in their use of language. And she doesn't like the prosecutor because he also strays towards cliche. He is verbose, he is grandiose. He is not precise enough. And there is, even in that, a strain of a kind of anti-Semitism. I think Arendt found these proceedings not too Jewish, because it depends what you mean by Jewish, but too Israeli Jewish. And I think if you had to say what it was that she wished this trial was more of, she wanted it to be more like Nuremberg. She wanted it to be less a morality tale to let people know why the state of Israel has to exist, and more a forensic examination of how a man like Eichmann could threaten the future of all of us. But the thing she really wished it were more is more European. She wanted a European trial. She was an émigré in the United States, European snob. And for many people, many Israelis, many Jews who are not Israeli, the central fact of the Eichmann trial, the point of the trial, the reason it had to happen in the way it happened, was that it was not European. The history that it told was the history of European Jews, a history in which the Jewish people of Europe were always dependent on others for justice. Someone had to save them. Someone had to rescue them. Someone had to protect them because they had no state, no laws, no courts of their own, no courts of their own in which they could try and prosecute their oppressors. This was a Jewish court trying a man who was, whatever Arendt might say, the serial killer of the Holocaust for his crimes. It was not waiting for the Europeans to do it. The history it told was the history of what happens to the Jews of Europe when they wait for European justice. And this is the thing that Arendt's snobbery obscures, and in many ways, this is the reason why Arendt's account is fundamentally flawed, because the story that the trial of Eichmann is telling is the story that justifies the trial of Eichmann under those circumstances, in that courtroom, in that way. Waiting for European justice means death. Next time in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about another of the epoch-making trials of the second half of the 20th century, from the same decade as the one I've talked about today, just a few years later. It's Nelson Mandela versus apartheid. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.